we have not been able to figure out is what would be the new policy and how would we sell that to the American electorate. And I sympathize with them on this problem. I do think, however, that Iran has something else in common with the United States besides strategic interests. And I think strategic interests alone are not enough to make a good ally. We actually have been very sloppy in picking our allies. Saudi Arabia became a great ally of ours. The Saudi regime has two pillars. One is the United States, and one is the clergy of Wahhabi Islam. Those two cannot support the same edifice, and September 11th ultimately was the result of the incompatibility of that policy. Saudi Arabia still is a country that helps us fight our enemies, at the same time it helps our enemies fight us. Pakistan is another one that falls into that category. Now, when you look at countries that would make good allies, I think one thing you look for is long-term strategic interests in common. You don't have that, for example, between us and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's long-term interests are not the same as ours. Iran's probably are. Those are state interests that don't change as regimes change. But there's one other thing. A good ally is not just a country that has long-term strategic goals in common with yours. It's also a country where the society looks something like your own society. Otherwise, these alliances are just alliances between elites and ruling classes and governments. Those are inherently unstable, as we've just learned these last few weeks. Stable alliances are between countries with societies that have a lot in common with each other. Now, one thing you notice when you travel in Iran is that Iran, and I'm going to keep saying this until someone gives me a counterexample, the population of Iran is the most pro-American population of any country in the world. It is astonishing, and every other American I've talked to who goes there comes back with the same reaction. I do think the younger generation is pretty much left behind the 1953 episode. There's tremendous admiration for the U.S. and what it's accomplished, and maybe they don't like their regime, so they see us opposed to the regime and like that. I think a lot of it is an admiration for American democracy. But it's the only country in the world where, as I happened to me when I was there last May on a street corner in Shiraz, I tell the guy I'm American within 10 seconds. I was surrounded by about 10 people jumping up and down and practically swooning and saying things like, as one woman said to me, "We know they say terrible things about us over there, but we love America so much." You don't even get that in Canada. You talk like that in the world anymore. Whatever we do in Iran, we shouldn't do anything to liquidate that pro-American sentiment in Iran, which is a huge strategic asset for us going forward. So Iran also has, as I said earlier, it's had 100 years of development of civil society and democracy. Their elections have not always been fair, unlike ours. Their constitutions have not always been obeyed, unlike ours. But they have an idea of what is a constitution, what is a parliament, what is a political party, how do you decide who to vote for? Is it someone from your region or clan, or is it somebody who reflects your views? They've had 100 years of working with this. Iran has a very sophisticated and vibrant civil society. It's as open and alive as the regime is closed and intolerant. The triumph of American popular culture in Iran is total. One of my friends recently went to Iran with Sean Penn, the actor. He told me the story that they were in the bazaar in Isfahan, going from one stall to another, and I stood and talked with a guy for a few minutes, an old man with a grandson, which is very typical. These bazaar stands were making copper, and after a few minutes they start walking away, and the young kid who speaks English calls out after them and says, "Excuse me, can you come back here for a minute? My grandfather has a question he wants to ask." So they turn around and go back to the stall, and then the grandfather and the grandson talk in Farsi for a minute, and the grandson then looks up and says, "My grandfather wants to know, what was it like being married to Madonna?" I didn't even know John Penn was married to Madonna. So Iran is a country that over the long run holds, I think, great potential as a partner for the United States for these two reasons. How we get from here to there is a big problem. Here's what I suggest. There is group of recently retired, very high-powered American diplomats, led by some people who held high positions at the Bush administration, but they're career diplomats who are just dying to be sent to Iran. They see this as the great diplomatic challenge of the age. I would love to assemble a team of 3 or 4 or 5 of these people with a couple of cultural interpreters and empower them. Go over there with no agenda, and just start from scratch and see what you can do. We don't know what the answer to that would be. We see this as a very uncooperative regime, but we've not really given it the basis to be cooperative. I think at the very least, a serious offer to negotiate would set off a lot of debates within the ruling elite. That alone would be positive at this moment. Certainly there are groups inside the regime that are implacably opposed to improving relations, just like there are in Washington. We've got Ayatollahs on both sides that have fought against normalization, who benefit from the conflict. Nonetheless, I would like to see us make an effort. We have not even asked the Iranians, for example, the elementary question, what would it take for you to do with your nuclear program what we're asking you to do? What would be enough for us as an incentive? We don't even know, much less whether we'd be willing to give it. We don't even know what it is. We're at a very early stage of this. Now, could a real effort and engagement produce a breakthrough? You couldn't be sure. This is not an easy regime to deal with. Nonetheless, I think this is also what ordinary Iranians would want. When I was there last year, I met many ordinary people, and I asked them this question. If we were to start engaging with your leaders, who have been so repressive, what would you think of that? Would you think of that as a betrayal, or would it be positive? And the response I got from almost everyone was, essentially our green movement or our protest movement doesn't have any good options anymore. All we have is bad options. But the best of the bad ones is that the regime would somehow be drawn out of its paranoia and its isolation. And if outside contacts could do that, that would be great. And let me just add, as you'll understand very well, I think, as an Iranian, and you want an interesting comment on this, having spent time in America. The Iranian sensibility is very different from the American sensibility. We imbibe science and reason. They imbibe Hafez poetry and Sadi. They're very cosmic. We believe every problem, we can break it down, it's going to have a solution. And you're going to have committees, and they're going to solve it, and it's going to be very positive. Everything's going to be broken down and solved. An ordinary Iranian would tell you, there's lots of life's big problems that are never going to be solved. You just have to live with them. This is not an American way of doing it. Americans also want everything to happen on our schedule. We want everything to happen really fast, because it should be happening now, so make it happen now. Iranians would tell you, we've been here for 50 centuries. We've had good centuries, we've had bad centuries. Things don't hold at their own pace. This is a big difference between the two cultures. Sometimes when countries that have been long estranged sit down for the first time, one of the techniques that journalists, conflict resolution specialists use is they say each side should now state one thing that they would like to get. If they could just get one thing from this negotiation. And if that happened, I know exactly the way it would start. First to the Americans. The Americans say, well, if we could get one thing, it would be a resolution of the nuclear. Then it goes to the Iranians. And the Iranians would say, if we could get one thing, it would be respect. And the Americans would say, but what is that? Give us something specific. And they would say, well, specifically, it's legal. The Americans would say, come on, get down to the pragmatic. And they say, no, before we can get to that, you got to understand, you have to respect it. This is why I think we would need not just linguistic translators, but cultural translators. These are countries that have been separated for a long time now, even though they have quite a common heritage. So I think that there is hope out there. The key thing is we have to understand we should be playing more on Iranian time. It's a long game with Iran. The trick is not to do anything that's going to make a solution more difficult. The situation in Iran is still unfolding. We're not at the end of this story. Let's not try to rush it too fast, and I think we're going to finally get the result we want.
Have you got any other questions?
No, I think it's being started the question.
Which you're right, yes.
When I listen to you, much of what you say, I think, has much sense. But it's all premised on the same set of beliefs that has led us sure that that will remain so. The second supposition is that the United States, on the whole, wishes to do good around the world. I regret to say, I don't actually, looking at the history, and actually as you related the history to it, I am not sure that that is so. The third is, I really do believe it is a large mistake that lots of people love the United States around the world. On the whole, that doesn't seem to be the case when we see what is unfolding here. Now, as you can probably tell, I grew up in a different country. I grew up in England. And I grew up at the end of the era of British power. And these types of argument are, for me, déjà vu. My parents' generation totally, and my grandparents' generation, totally believed that British power had always been used for the betterment of people, and that sacrifices had been made on behalf of bettering these people. And when the winds of change and anti-colonialism came, they were astonished, because didn't these people love us and respect us and want our way of life? And then the whole world changed. And Britain was no longer a great powerful thing, and had to go through a whole somewhat difficult reimagining of it. I think we're at the beginning of the era when the United States has to reimagine itself. And the notion of going around and getting allies who may think like us, and we say, for what purpose, for what purpose? I think it's gone. And one has to sort of first recognize your different position in the world and what it's likely to be in the future. And then, when you start to talk about allies and so on, you've ultimately got to ask yourself, well, what do we want them for if they're going to be allies? What is the overall goal that you're moving towards? And are we all stuck in this little, we're all different nations, and somehow or other we have to make these alliances and so forth and so on, and ultimately we'll stack up against another lot. So I have to say, I think most of the assumptions on which you move forward, which seem benign, are probably mistaken.
Well, let me make a few reactions to that. First of all, I do think that the United States is going to remain a powerful military force for well beyond the lifetime of everybody in this room. Now, the rise and fall of empires is one of the constants of history. You obviously lived through part of it. And I think we are seeing some of that now. The United States is certainly losing power in a relative sense, and that's going to continue. I actually think that's a good thing. The rise of India and China and Russia and Brazil and Turkey and so forth is a positive fact, and I think it's going to be one of the main factors of the 20th century, the rise of these middle powers. I agree that it's a good idea to put aside the idea that the United States has a more self-sacrificing role in the world than any other country. This is foolish. This is why I think we should get back to the idea of interest. We like to think that all we do is act on behalf of human rights or NATO or the United Nations or world peace. I think we should get over those illusions. As for allies, I do think that allies are going to become more important for the United States, not less important in the future. We always thought we didn't need allies because all we wanted was servants, essentially. That's what we used to call allies. And we were able to do that. During the Cold War period, we had enough strength. So we were able to make countries do things that were actually against their own interests and in our interests. We can't do that anymore. In the Middle East in particular, I think we really lost our way. We have the sense that we're the only ones who get the Middle East. No other country really gets it. They don't understand what's true. Even the countries in the region don't get the region. We see it. We have to get past that attitude. And if we want to try to understand the Middle East, I think we need to find countries that can help guide us there. I actually think Turkey would be an ideal one for us, because Turkey is a country that shares most of our assumptions about the world. It's very upset with our policies toward Iran and once you get past that, then there's no point in looking for real allies in the modern world. As far as giving up old paradigms, I fully agree with this, and I think the United States needs a major thinking of its role in this world. We Americans see the world as a big place that needs to be managed, and we're called upon to do the managing. And when something goes wrong in Bolivia or Burundi or Bangladesh or any other country that starts with a B, we have to go there and fix it. This is the underlying assumption of the American approach to the world, and that's really something that has to change. We have to realize that the world's not going to collapse if those countries have to face their own problems. We have much too heavy a military footprint, and we have much too egocentric view of the world. So there's a big difference between the way we see the world and the way people everywhere else in the world see it, even in big countries like England or Brazil or Russia or China. In those countries, people see the world as made up of lots of different countries. We're one country, there's another one over here, and there's another one over there. Americans don't look at the world this way. Americans see the world as divided into two groups of countries. One group is the United States. The other group is all the other countries, made up of people that are mostly very unhappy, because they don't have the only thing that's really worth having in life, which is the chance to be American. No other country in the world believes this, and this is something we really need to get over as well.
You know what, yeah.
Yeah, I just like comment about the allies. I think the concept of like U.S.-Iran alliance is a little bit overly optimistic. I mean, I think what we should be thinking about, or even partners, at least not within the next like 10, 20 years, if the regime in Iran remains the way it is, because I think it's really hard for Americans to sell Iranians as an ally, and I think it's as hard for Iranian government to sell America as an ally. But what we could think of, I think, is just working on the common interest, not necessarily being allies, but just trying to what we did during U.S. Afghanistan, when the U.S. first invaded Afghanistan, and the way Iran cooperated just because they had the same interest against Taliban, and they could work on that without being allies. So I think that
the drug issue would be another one that Iran has a drug problem. But I saw this terrifying quote in the Financial Times a couple of weeks ago from an unnamed high administration official talking about Iran and how they wanted to keep the focus on the nuclear issue. And he said, "We don't want to get distracted or bogged down in confidence-building measures." Isn't this what we should be doing? Exactly, confidence-building measures? But actually, if you want to maintain the paradigm of conflict, you don't want to find any common project. But I agree with you. This would be the way to start on issues where we clearly have a common interest.
I think that we some of us here heard Trita Parsi earlier today, and one of the things that he said was that there is an institutional need to demonize Iran in our country amongst in the high levels of our government. And he said there are some people who've made their whole careers on being Iran, finding out what's wrong with Iran, why Iran needs to be our enemy. So we're dealing with and he said he feels that one of the big problems is that it leaves really almost what you said. It leaves both of you that it leaves very little space for Obama to make even any conciliatory gestures towards us. But I love the idea of sending a diplomat.
Unleash the dream team.
All right. But please, let's have some questions from, yes, James.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to 1953 for a minute and ask a couple of questions about that. It's fitting that we have British and American people participate.
And the Iranians.
Yes, of course. But since the British, promoted the coup, and then the United States took it over. The two questions are recently, and this may be mainly for Steve. There's a man, I think his name is Abani, who's from Stanford and the Hoover Institute, who just got a new book out called The Shah. And he was doing a book tour, and I heard him speak, and he said a couple of things which I found interesting. One was that he thought that there was much less support for Mossadegh at the end when the coup actually finally was successful that there had been a significant erosion of support. They didn't have a lot of support. Nobody really came out and fought for very, very long or hard over those several days. And he also said that the letter of dismissal that was delivered to him, that in your book you describe as having been drafted by the CIA, he didn't mention the CIA's involvement in that, and said that he interpreted it as having been a constitutional dismissal of Mossadegh. So that's the first part. The second part is about Operation Ajax, which is the code name for the covert operation, the coup. I just happened to be looking at the New York Times website account from 2000, which you also reference in your book, where there's a CIA document, and then the James Risen's analysis over several chapters. And I jumped to the section on the media, and it was all about a New York Times reporter by the name of, I guess, Kenneth Love. And I see that you write about it. I haven't read your book yet, so I wonder if you could tell us a little about Mr. Love and the role of the New York Times and media in general in these kinds of situations.
Well, first of all, you're right that, let's say the narrative of the 1953 coup is being enriched by a variety of interpretations. In that book, you're right, this new book does not even have the term CIA or Central Intelligence Agency in the index. And it's the history of the 1953 coup and the Shah's rule. I think you can probably have a variety of perspectives on how popular Mossadegh was towards the end of his term. I could only say this: if it's actually true that he was unpopular and was going to fall anyway, then that makes the coup even. President of Guatemala was this was an operation more inside Iran. So the real sin of the New York Times reporter, and I met him when I was doing my book, and he told me, we just had no idea what was going on, because we didn't even know there was such a thing as the CIA, and the initials CIA would not have meant anything to any American or any of us. We had no concept of this then. Bear in mind, we were at the very beginning of the covert action era. The CIA had never overthrown a government before. That was why Harry Truman had refused to do it. It was only when Eisenhower and the Dulles brothers came in that the policy changed. Our press operation during Operation Ajax was mainly focused inside Iran. When Kermit Roosevelt, who was the chief CIA operative that we sent to carry out this coup, got there, one of the first things he did was started bribing the newspaper editors and the journalists and the columnists, who proved amazingly willing to be bribed. And by his own account, he had 80% of the newspapers in Tehran on the CIA payroll within a matter of a week or two. They were churning out stories every day about Mossadegh was a Jew, a homosexual, a British agent, everything you could think of. And in fact, there was such demand, and papers were so ready to print everything, they didn't even have enough reporters to write it. And one of the CIA operatives, who later wrote a book, Richard Cotton, was working back in Washington on the CIA project. And he was drafted to write made-up articles attacking Mossadegh. And so he would be sitting in Washington, and he'd make up these stories, and Mossadegh did this, Mossadegh did that, and then he would send them off to Kermit Roosevelt, who would have them translated, and then they would appear in the Iran press. But what he wrote in his book years later was that at the CIA, the people following Iran were on two different sides of the corridor. One was the covert operatives, and the others were the analysts. They didn't even know there was a covert operation going on. And we have these analysts rush over to us and say, wow, look how unpopular Mossadegh is. Look at this article they just printed. I wrote that article 13 days ago. It flashed back there, it flashed back to you, and you're now using it as evidence for how unpopular Mossadegh is. So the press campaign was very successful, and certainly set a paradigm for future American covert operations.
All because U.S. was very oil.
It was all about oil. I think, when diplomats in the West learn about diplomatic history, they're learning a lot about alliances and power politics, but the fervent desire of people in poor countries to control their own resources has never been a part of European politics, so it's not something that European diplomats are familiar with. They couldn't believe that this was a legitimate expression of Iranian will. It had to be manipulated by somewhere else. It was all got down to resources in the end.
Perfect segue. 1953, fast forward to December 2010. WikiLeaks, Ahmadinejad as a moderate. Now what?
Well, I don't know, you probably aren't following everything, the ins and outs of Tehran lately, but I've been following this one. It's a really interesting story about Hedda Gabler. Have you been following this one? So Hedda Gabler, the Ibsen play, it was produced in Tehran like a month ago. And there was some, I mean, naturally didn't play out quite the way Ibsen wrote it, but there was a certain amount of physical contact, and it was quite a daring, quite popular play. After 6 performances, it was shut down. And now there's huge debate. What is it right? Is it wrong? Is it only 100 years old? Is it too modern for Iran? Actually, what happened, as it now turned out, is that Ahmadinejad's people approved it. Then it was the group behind the mullahs that are closing it down. Everything, even whether a play is performed or not, is a stage for a larger confrontation between factions in Iran. I do think that Ahmadinejad, in many ways, would be the more secular, the less religious type of figure. For example, at the beginning of the Islamic Revolution, it was considered very negative to talk about the pre-Islamic past. You weren't supposed to talk about how great Cyrus was. They even wanted to bulldoze Persepolis briefly, because those were all pre-Islamic, that was all an infidel faith. Now, the Ahmadinejad government is talking about Cyrus, and the Cyrus cylinder. They want to bring it back now for display in Iran from America. This is not something, a project that the mullahs would like. The political arena in Iran is almost opaque. It's quite an unsettled system. Sometimes I think it functions more like an opposition movement that's trying to figure out what to do than like an established government. So, I feel that this process has its own dynamic, and the U.S., if it wants to play a role, should play a role by offering Iranians the chance to say what they want. And I'd add this one thing. You don't want to attack your enemy where he's strong, okay? And the place where the Iranian regime is strong is the nuclear program. That's about the one thing they're doing that everybody in Iran thinks is good. They may not want to have nuclear weapons, but the idea that Iran should have a nuclear program is widely shared by Iranians of every stripe. We should be focusing on the regime where it's weaker, which is its credentials for democracy and human rights. We shouldn't be beating them on the one place where everybody supports them. But, of course, our own credentials in that area aren't so good, and it makes us feel a little bit strange to be shaking a finger at the Iranians and saying, you're not democratic enough. You should have a democracy over there. Actually, they look back and say, hey, wait a minute. We have a democracy here. And so you came in and took it away from us. So our credibility